Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is a very, very good organisation. It does a lot of things to promote animal studies, particularly in the Australasian area. In particular, it holds a conference, and that conference is going to come up in the middle of this year. It's going to be held in New Zealand. It's going to be absolutely fantastic. It's called Decolonising Animals. So I really encourage everyone to think about coming to the ASA conference and also becoming a member of ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Okay, well, this is an extra special episode of Knowing Animals. Very unusually, this episode is being recorded in front of a live audience. I'm here at the University of Sheffield. I'm at their ShARC Tails event, which is their animal studies group. They're holding a 2-day conference in which all their PhD students, their master's students and other scholars are coming together to discuss animal issues. It's been an absolutely fantastic 2-day event. And as part of the event, the ShARC Tails people have invited me to record a live episode of the Knowing Animals podcast. So, I'm being joined by a very, very special guest, Dr. Joe Wills. Joe is lecturer in law at the University of Leicester, and today we're going to discuss his article, A Nation of Animal Lovers, ? The case for a general animal killing offence in UK law. And that paper is going to appear very soon in the King's Law Review. Welcome to the podcast, Joe.
Thanks, Siobhan. It's great to be here. I'm a big fan of the podcast and I've learned a lot from it.
Oh, thanks, Joe. That's lovely.
I think we maybe should let listeners know that these mics don't pick very much background noise up. So if they don't hear whooping and applauding and lots of laughter, they can blame the mics.
The audience just went crazy. Okay, Joe, as a listener, you'll know that my first question is always, why this piece of work?
Yeah, so it seems to me that we're living in a time of unprecedented debate about the moral status of animals and the obligations that we owe to them as humans. And I think an increasingly big part of that debate centres around the ethics of killing animals. And indeed, there's been a quite lively and robust debate on this issue in political theory, in moral philosophy, but perhaps most significantly in society at large. I'm thinking particularly in the UK context of this big growth of the vegan movement over the last decade, about a 360% increase, according to some research. And part of the vegan movement's idea, it seems to me, is that it's not merely wrong to mistreat animals whilst they're alive, but a concern of many vegans and vegetarians is the killing of animals for food and various other reasons. So I found it quite surprising when I consulted the legal literature that there was very little debate around the killing of animals. The focus overwhelmingly of discussions in the legal context is the treatment of animals whilst they're alive. And I think that in itself is a reflection of at least the substantive law in the UK context really doesn't have any general prohibitions on the killing of animals at all. Now, there are 3 limited exceptions to this. If you kill an animal belonging to another person, you can be liable for a property offence like criminal damage or poaching or something like that. There are certain endangered or rare wild species that are protected, such as the beloved British red squirrel. And there are also some restrictions on the means by which animals can be killed. So standardly, for example, animals who are killed for meat have to be stunned prior to slaughter. But outside of these limited exceptions, there are no real general prohibitions on the killing of animals. And for the audience, it might be useful if I give a case to starkly illustrate where the law is on this. And this is a Scottish case from 1983 called Patchett and McDougall. And in this case, the defendant, Mr. Patchett, enters a pen on an agricultural college, and he enters with a 12-bore shotgun. And he approaches a 15-month collie dog and kills the dog by shooting him in the head at point-blank range. And he's charged with the offence of wantonly and unreasonably causing unnecessary suffering to an animal. And he's convicted of this at trial, but appeals against his conviction on the basis that the prosecutor failed to adduce evidence that he'd caused any suffering. And his appeal's heard before a panel of 3 judges at the Scottish High Court, and they agree with him and quash his conviction. They say that there was no evidence adduced that the dog suffered prior to death, and that the mere killing of an animal does not engage the relevant cruelty statute. And I think many people would be shocked at this decision, but it was later affirmed by the English High Court in 1998. And since then, we've had the passing of the Animal Welfare Act of 2006, which could have addressed this issue, but it's largely silent on the issue of killing animals. There are 2 parts of the Act where it's mentioned, and these are in the 2 main offences contained within the Act. The first is the offence of causing unnecessary suffering, and the second is the offence of failing to take reasonable steps to protect an animal's welfare. And in both of these offences, there's a subsection that says these offences do not apply to the appropriate and humane killing of an animal, or the destruction of the animal is the language that statute uses. And there's some room for speculation about what this means. I think in relation to the unnecessary suffering offence, this doesn't change the Patchett ruling at all. I think there's more room to dispute what it means in the context of the animal welfare offence, the Section 9 offence in the Animal Welfare Act. But there's no evidence of the issue of killing being discussed during the parliamentary debates around this offence, and to my knowledge there have been no cases that directly address this. And so what I want to do in the paper is argue that we need a new offence that directly addresses the issue of killing animals.
Wonderful. So there are a lot of things in that, and a lot of different things I want to ask you about, but can you start by telling us how this British law sits in relation to other laws around the world? Is this what we see in other Western jurisdictions? How does this intersect with EU law, for example? Mm-hmm. Is this standard practice?
Mm-hmm. Well, with regard to EU law is similarly silent on the issue of killing animals per se. With the exception of some wildlife conservation laws. But when it comes to different jurisdictions, there's a wide variety of perspectives. Many other Western jurisdictions have taken a similar approach to the United Kingdom, but there are some that have adopted different approaches. Perhaps the most important ones would be Austria and Germany, both of which have animal killing offences that prohibit the killing of vertebrate animals when there is no sound or good reason to do so.
So I guess that brings us to the key question. Is death a harm for animals? Why should we worry about killing animals?
So in the paper I present 2 different arguments as to why there should be an animal killing offence in the UK context. And the approach by which I make this argument is that I adopt an approach that's known as immanent critique. And this is an approach taken from critical theory, which attempts to criticize a theory or practice not according to some external standard, but to its own internal point of view. Right? So you're saying you're trying to hoist an approach by its own petard. And I think in the UK context, in UK legal culture, there are already two widely accepted norms that the failure to restrict any killings on animals violates. The first of those is the idea that animal welfare has independent value that ought to be protected, and the second is that the harm principle provides a good reason to criminalise conduct. That's to say that if certain types of harms are imposed on others, it ought to be criminalised. And to the question of whether killing animals harms them, I argue in the paper it does, and it's also a welfare issue. And that's because animals do not merely have the capacity to suffer, but they also have the capacity for pleasure, to experience the good things in life. And when you deprive an animal of a life that will have future good experiences, you're depriving them of those good experiences and therefore interfering with their welfare and therefore harming them.
So, Joe, are you trying to stop people eating meat?
Well, I think that there's a difference between what one would want to do in an ideal world and what is possible in present circumstances. For the most part, the paper is dealing with conceptual and normative questions rather than practical ones. I'm really just staking out the general claim that something ought to be done with regard to the killing of animals. But in the conclusion of the paper, I suggest a pragmatic compromise between the status quo and the type of world that many animal rights advocates would like to see. And the argument I put forward, or the idea I put forward, is that there should be an offence of causing the unnecessary death of an animal. And that roughly mirrors the present approach to animal suffering, which prohibits the unnecessary suffering of animals. And so then there would be scope to think about what unnecessary means. If we turn to the German context, of course, the prohibition on killing animals has not outlawed the meat industry, but it has prohibited a number of types of killing that are all too common in other jurisdictions. For example, the killing of unwanted animals in shelters, which has been more or less outlawed in the German context, except in a few circumstances. And I think the adoption rates in German shelters are about 90%. In the German context, the prohibition has also been used to rehome animals that have been used as research subjects, whereas in the UK they're almost all killed. And even outside of circumstances where the law has prohibited certain types of killing, having these sorts of offences nonetheless has other sorts of benefits, such as generating societal and political debates. So again, to draw on the German context, a case was brought by an animal advocacy group a few years ago challenging the killing of day-old male chicks in the egg industry. And the case was unsuccessful. The court said that no, that the killing of chicks was justified under the law, but it nonetheless sparked all sorts of debates within the German parliament. The Green Party introduced a new bill. It was discussed in the press. And there have also been technological developments that have sprung from it. So researchers at Leipzig University have developed a technology that can determine the sex of a chicken at embryo stage, which some estimates suggest will be in all hatcheries in Germany by 2020, and that could spare about 45 million deaths every year, and that's still far from what my ideal approach to egg consumption would be, but it's certainly an improvement on the status quo. But perhaps the final benefit of introducing such an offence would be what it would symbolize, right? Because one of the functions of the criminal law that many people talk about is that it's about communicating values. And to have a law that prohibits the killing of animals at least communicates the value that animal lives matter and that the deprivation of them is something serious.
So, is this a nation of animal lovers?
Well, we arrogantly often self-declare ourselves to be so, but I wouldn't say that this is a nation of animal lovers. At a stretch, we're a nation of dog and cat and possibly horse lovers, but not even that is reflected in our law at the moment, as the Patchett case illustrates. We have a legal system that doesn't rule out by definition the wanton and unreasonable shooting of a dog in the head at point-blank range, then I don't think it's up to scratch.
Well, Joe, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Ready as I'll ever be.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
This is a tricky question for me, actually, because when I got interested in animal rights issues, I just got a whole ton of books out together and sort of dipped in between them. So these included Peter Singer's Animal Liberation, Tom Regan's The Case for Animal Rights, Carol J. Adams' Sexual Politics of Meat. But in terms of the first book that really grabbed me and that I just had to read cover to cover, it was Evelyn Plewer's Beyond Prejudice, The Moral Significance of Human and Non-Human Animals. And I was just really impressed by the rigor and depth of the analysis in this book, but also the fact that it's interspersed with quite a lot of humour and stories, and I found it a really captivating read. So in terms of cover to cover, it would be Evelyn Plewer's book.
Wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
As someone relatively new to animal studies, that's very easy for me. It was a book chapter I wrote in 2016 called The Intentional Killing of Field Animals and Ethical Veganism. And this is a piece that grapples with the ethical issue of the lethal methods that farmers often use against field animals to protect their crops, such as poisons and traps and pesticides and so forth. And in the article I try and articulate what the relevant ethical distinctions are between those types of killings and the type of killings that occur in the animal agribusiness industries. And that's recently come out in an edited volume called Ethical Vegetarianism and Veganism with Routledge. Wonderful.
I'm very aware of saying the word wonderful too much in this interview, but I can't help it. Your answers are wonderful, Joe. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Oh, there are so many, it's difficult to pick one. But if I had to pick one, I'd probably say Will Kimlicker. I'm just always interested in what he has to write, and I always find myself very impressed with the way he seems to seamlessly glide between moral and political and legal analysis and the connections that both he and Sue Donaldson make between oppression of animals and oppression of human beings. So all round, I'd say Will Kimlicker.
Wonderful. Certainly a very impressive figure. The animal studies scholars in this room don't take any offence at that response. What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
So this is a tricky one, and as someone relatively new to this is something I'm trying to figure out myself. One thing I'd say is I think it's really important to be incredibly self-critical. And that's because really the background conditions in society are just so terrible for animals that it's genuinely difficult trying to figure out how best you can intervene on their behalf. And I think it's really easy to fall into one of two, perhaps not particularly desirable avenues when you do this, particularly when you're advocating for legal or political changes. And the first of those is a sort of apologism, wherein you advocate for incremental or small changes that don't really get to the heart of the problematic ways of thinking about animals and treating them, and might even in some ways reinforce those problematic attitudes and practices. But the other danger is becoming too utopian, right? And advocating for changes that might correspond with what justice requires, but are so far away from the status quo that they have little practical significance. And so I think trying to find a golden mean between these two poles is very difficult, and I have grave doubts about the work I've done and whether I've struck that balance right. But I think it's just tricky, and we should be sort of constantly self-critical and reflect on where we want to stake our claims within this range of approaches.
Fabulous. If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
This question makes me feel giddy with power. So if I could wave my magic wand and change one thing, I would say challenging the perception of animals as commodities or as resources or things for us to use, to view them as some bodies, not some things, and to treat them and their interests with respect. I know that's not a particularly original thought, but I do think it is the fundamental problem that needs addressing if we're going to have a more just world for animals.
Wonderful. Well, Joe, what are you working on next?
So I'm working on a few issues on animals and the criminal law, and also some issues relating to animals and international law and human rights law, particularly how judges in human rights cases should adjudicate human rights claims when they involve conflicts between human and animal interests.
Fantastic. And where can people find your work?
So I'm not really on social media. You can find my staff page at Leicester University. I've also got an Academia EDU account. I haven't updated either of them as much as I should, but you can find my email contact details on the my Leicester page anyway.
Well, Joe, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals. Thank you to everyone from ShARC Tails for joining us for Knowing Animals, and thank you to the audience for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, you can follow us on social media at knowing_animals. We also have a Facebook page and a Instagram account. Finally, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.